The barking echoed through the smoke-choked ruins of Poplar, East London, cutting through the acrid smell of cordite and the groans of shattered buildings still settling after the night's raid. Air Raid Warden E. King had seen plenty of strays during the Blitz, dogs abandoned when families fled the city, or worse, orphaned when their owners never made it to the shelter. But this one was different. Standing atop a mound of brick and timber that had been someone's home just 8 hours earlier, a scruffy terrier with wiry tan fur and eyes that had seen too much refused to leave. September 1940, and London was burning. Hitler's Luftwaffe had unleashed hell on Britain's capital, and every night brought fresh devastation, fresh loss, fresh graves to dig. King expected the dog to run when he approached. They always did. Instead, the terrier barked again, more urgently, pawing at the rubble beneath its feet. King almost walked away. He had a sector to patrol, shelters to check, possibly dozens of casualties still trapped in collapsed buildings. But something in that bark stopped him. It wasn't fear, it wasn't hunger, it was purpose. What happened in the next 60 seconds would transform civil defense operations for the next 80 years. The small dog no one wanted was about to show a war-torn city what it meant to never give up on the buried and the lost. On September 7, 1940, 348 German bombers crossed the English Channel toward London's East End. The Blitz had begun, a sustained bombing campaign that would continue for 8 months, claiming over 40,000 civilian lives and destroying more than 1 million homes. Hitler's strategy was to break British morale and force surrender. It would fail, but not before transforming vast sections of London into landscapes of devastation. Poplar sat in the heart of the target zone, a working-class district that smelled of the Thames and engine oil, where dockers and factory workers lived in rows of terraced houses. When war came, many families sent their children to the countryside, but most adults stayed. They had jobs, homes, lives they couldn't abandon. This was their London. They would face what came. Through Poplar's rubble-strewn streets, a small terrier moved like a ghost. Before he had a name, he was just another casualty of war, a mixed-breed dog, perhaps 15 pounds, with wiry tan fur matted with brick dust and ribs showing through skin stretched too tight. His eyes carried the wariness of an animal who'd learned humans couldn't be trusted. Abandoned when his family evacuated, or orphaned when they died in the raids. What mattered now was survival, scavenging scraps, drinking from burst water mains, sleeping in shattered buildings that might collapse at any moment. Then came the sirens, that rising, falling wail that meant death was minutes away. The small terrier had learned to recognize it, learned it preceded the distant drone of hundreds of engines, a mechanical thunder that filled the sky. The whistling came next, high explosives in descent, a shriek that ended in earth-shaking concussion. Buildings didn't simply collapse, they exploded, brick and timber transformed into deadly fragments, flying hundreds of feet. Fire followed immediately, fed by ruptured gas mains, spreading through streets too narrow for firefighters to contain. When the all-clear sounded, the dog emerged from shelter. Every instinct screamed to flee this place of death, to run from the bombs, but he didn't. He moved toward the destruction, toward rubble piles that had been homes hours earlier, toward something his nose detected beneath tons of shattered brick. Faint, desperate, human, alive but dying. He didn't understand what drove him toward danger instead of away. He only knew he couldn't leave, not while that scent remained, not while someone was still breathing in the darkness below.
Air Raid Warden E. King was 52 and had known Poplar his entire life. He'd worked the docks since 14, knew every street by heart, remembered the Zeppelin raids from the Great War. Now he patrolled wearing a steel helmet, carrying a gas mask and hand rattle for gas warnings. His duties? enforce blackout regulations, direct civilians to shelters during raids, search for survivors after, and mark dangerous buildings with chalk. The morning after Poplar's first major raid, King found a terrier standing atop what had been the Morrison family's house, 3 stories reduced to rubble. The dog was barking with focused intensity, not random yapping, but deliberate communication directed at a specific point. King expected it to bolt as he approached. It didn't. Instead, it locked eyes with him, intelligent brown eyes, barked again, and began pawing urgently at the debris. King's first instinct was to move on. He had 18 buildings to inspect, possibly dozens of casualties. But something in that bark stopped him, not fear or hunger, urgency. He knelt in the debris, listening past the ambient sounds, distant sirens, groaning buildings, crackling fires. Then he heard it. Beneath tons of brick, impossibly faint, tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. The old prisoner's signal. Someone alive, someone this dog had found. King called for the heavy rescue squad, specialized teams with jacks, timber supports, and the courage to dig into unstable ruins. The operation took 4 hours of dangerous work. The building groaned continuously, threatening collapse. Gas leaks hissed from ruptured mains, but they kept digging, following the dog's alert, until they reached the Morrison shelter, an indoor steel cage designed to create a protective void when everything collapsed. Inside, barely conscious but breathing, were Mrs. Morrison and her daughter Emily. 2 lives saved because a stray dog wouldn't stop barking. When they brought the survivors into daylight, King knelt beside the terrier and offered scraps from his lunch. The dog approached cautiously, took the food without fleeing. King studied those intelligent eyes, the wiry tan coat matted with dust, the compact frame built for endurance. "You're a scrappy little thing," he said. "All right, Rip, you can stick around if you're going to make yourself useful." The name came from letters painted on shattered buildings, R.I.P., rest in peace, marking homes that had become tombs. But this dog represented the opposite of death. He was about finding life in the ruins.
Air Raid Post B132 occupied a converted shopfront on South Hill Street, windows replaced with sandbags, steel reinforcement visible overhead. A brick surface shelter stood in the back alley. Inside, 6 wardens worked rotating shifts: E. King, Mrs. Doris Fletcher, Jack Morris, Thomas Webb, young Peter Sykes, barely 20, and Arthur Chen, whose family had run a laundry nearby for generations. They caught sleep between alerts, shared rationed tea, smoked cigarettes to calm shaking hands, and told stories that kept terror at bay. Rip became part of this family almost immediately. The wardens fed him scraps, cleared a corner near the stove for sleep, let him follow on patrols. But within days they noticed something crucial. Rip wasn't simply tagging along, he was working. During post-raid searches, he would freeze at seemingly empty ruins, body rigid, then bark insistently. Initially, they thought he was chasing rats, but when King investigated that first alert, they found an elderly man trapped in a basement they'd missed. After that, they investigated every alert. Rip was never wrong. Sometimes survivors, sometimes bodies deserving proper burial, but always someone the wardens had missed. Mrs. Fletcher, who'd kept terriers before the war, explained over weak tea one morning. "Dogs smell things we can't. He's smelling people under the rubble, their breath, sweat, probably even fear. Terriers were bred to go into holes after rats and foxes, work underground. This is just bigger holes, except he's not hunting, he's rescuing." The science supported her theory. Dogs possess roughly 300 million scent receptors compared to humans' 6 million, allowing them to detect chemical signatures invisible to human senses. Rip was smelling life beneath tons of debris. Over 6 weeks spanning late September through October, Rip found 17 people buried in collapsed buildings. His method became protocol. Approach a ruin, sniff systematically, freeze when detecting trapped humans, then alert with rigid posture, focused barking, and urgent pawing. The wardens learned to read him like an instrument. If Rip said someone was there, they called heavy rescue. They trusted him absolutely. But the work exacted a brutal toll. Rip navigated unstable rubble that shifted without warning, inhaled smoke and toxic gases, cut his paws on sharp debris until they bled. He worked through exhaustion and injury, through every reason to stop, and every night brought fresh raids, fresh destruction, fresh chances to die doing what he'd decided was his purpose. By October's end, this small terrier had become irreplaceable. Post B132's rescue rate exceeded every other station, and everyone knew why.
November 1940 brought some of the war's most devastating raids. On November 14, the Luftwaffe destroyed Coventry in a single night, killing over 500 civilians and coining a new German verb, Coventrieren, to obliterate. The campaign targeted industrial cities where Britain built weapons and aircraft. London remained a primary target, enduring raids involving hundreds of bombers dropping tons of high explosives and incendiaries designed to create firestorms. The night of November 17 tested post B132 beyond anything they'd experienced. Sirens began at 6:47 p.m. and didn't stop until 5:23 a.m., nearly 11 hours of continuous bombing. The sector took 17 direct hits, buildings exploding, fires spreading, water mains bursting, gas leaks hissing. The wardens worked in relays. Rip never stopped. At 7:15 p.m., barely 30 minutes in, a direct hit collapsed a boarding house. Rip found 3 children trapped in a basement within 20 minutes. At 9:30 p.m., he located an elderly man pinned in an Anderson shelter, an outdoor steel structure designed for garden burial, creating protective underground space. The man had been there 3 hours, losing consciousness. At 11:45 p.m., while rescue squads prepared to abandon a collapsed terrace, Rip's barking led them to a mother and infant in a gap so small it took 2 hours to extract them. At 2:20 a.m., a secondary collapse buried a warden from the neighboring post. Rip found him under fresh rubble within minutes. At 4:40 a.m., as dawn approached, he led teams to a family of 4 in a surface shelter, brick structures built in streets for those who couldn't reach deeper protection. When true dawn broke, Rip was limping badly, his paws bloody from navigating sharp debris for 11 hours. His wiry coat was blackened with soot and brick dust. King tried to make him rest, offering water and food in the post's corner that had become Rip's space. The dog drank, then immediately returned to patrol, while daylight revealed devastation that seemed impossible. Entire streets erased, fires still burning, the smell of gas and cordite and death hanging over everything. Word spread through the civil defense network with remarkable speed. Post B132 had a dog that could find anyone, anywhere, under conditions that defeated human senses. Wardens from other posts began requesting assistance. Newspapers started asking questions. But there was a growing problem. Rip wasn't official. He had no registration, no training certification, no authorization to participate in civil defense operations. He was just a stray who decided to save lives. And in a world governed by regulations and official procedures, that presented complications that would soon demand resolution. In December 1940, Mr. Harrington from the Regional Civil Defense Authority arrived at post B132 to investigate reports of an unauthorized animal in rescue operations. Civil defense regulations were explicit. Animals required formal training and certification.
The reasoning was sound. Uncontrolled animals could compromise rescues, trigger collapses, or provide false alerts. Harrington was sympathetic but inflexible. I understand he's been helpful, but we cannot establish precedent for untrained animals in dangerous operations. What if he gets killed? What if he causes a collapse? What if he gives false alerts? King, who had followed regulations for 20 years, refused to comply. He presented documentation maintained over 10 weeks, 17 confirmed rescues, 0 false positives, multiple lives saved. Mrs. Fletcher testified about Rip's consistent behavior patterns, systematic search, rigid body alert, focused barking only over buried victims. Other wardens vouched for his absolute reliability. But Harrington remained firm. Rules existed for good reasons. The dog needed to be removed. King proposed a compromise: test Rip under controlled conditions, stage scenarios with hidden volunteers. If Rip found them consistently, consider him proven. If he failed, King would accept removal. Harrington agreed, believing the test would settle matters. They staged 3 scenarios in stable, damaged buildings. First, a volunteer in a basement covered with debris. Second, a volunteer in an Anderson shelter buried under sandbags and timber. Third, a volunteer in a partially collapsed room accessible only through a small gap. These replicated actual operational conditions. Rip found all 3 in under 4 minutes each. His method remained consistent: systematic approach, focused sniffing, rigid body upon detection, urgent barking while pawing the location. Harrington watched in silence, confirming volunteers had remained still and quiet. After the 3rd find, he turned to King. "Has he ever been wrong?" King met his eyes. "Not once." Harrington couldn't officially authorize an untrained dog, but he could exercise discretion. "I'm going to write that I found no unauthorized animals at post B132. What I do find is a warden team with exceptional rescue rates. Continue as you are, Mr. King, but if that dog gets hurt, causes an incident, or gives even one false alert, this arrangement ends immediately." It was conditional approval disguised as official blindness. Rip could stay, but only as long as he remained perfect. January through May 1941 marked the Blitz's final phase. The Luftwaffe knew that if they couldn't break British morale by summer, invasion would be impossible. They intensified raids with everything remaining. Through it all, Rip worked. Post B132 kept meticulous records in King's logbook. September-October 1940, 17 rescues. November, 23. December, 19. January 1941, 21. February, 12. March, 8, as raids declined. By May 1941, when Hitler redirected forces eastward for the Soviet invasion, the total stood at 102 confirmed rescues. Some rescues became legendary within civil defense circles. In February, Rip alerted to a collapsed factory where 12 workers were buried under tons of industrial machinery and structural debris. The rescue took 7 hours of dangerous excavation through unstable wreckage. Rip remained at the site the entire time, adjusting his alerts as digging revealed new voids and trapped spaces, guiding rescuers through a 3-dimensional maze of destruction. All 12 workers survived. In March, a bomb struck the Rose and Crown pub during evening hours, burying 38 people beneath what had been a social hub where neighbors gathered to endure the war together. Rip worked through the wreckage systematically, alerting to each trapped group in sequence. The rescue operation lasted 19 hours. 29 people were pulled out alive. Rip's methodical searching pattern ensured no one was missed in the chaos. April brought the rescue that haunted King's dreams. 5-year-old Margaret had been missing for 18 hours, presumed killed when her house was destroyed. Search teams had marked the site as cleared, bodies recovered, no survivors. Rip found her wedged under a collapsed staircase in a void so small rescuers initially doubted anyone could be there. She was unconscious but alive. Extraction took 3 hours of delicate work. She recovered fully. May 10, 1941, the Blitz's final major raid brought 550 German bombers over London in one last apocalyptic assault. Rip worked through that night, finding his 99th, 100th, and 101st rescues. The symbolic 100th was Catherine Davies, a school teacher buried in her Anderson shelter for 11 hours. When rescue teams finally pulled her into daylight, her first words were, "Was it the dog that found me? God bless that dog." By May's end, Rip was visibly aged beyond his years. His paws bore scars from countless cuts that had healed and reopened and healed again. His breathing was labored from months of smoke inhalation and toxic gas exposure. His wiry coat was permanently stained with brick dust that no amount of brushing could remove, a gray patina of destruction that had become part of his appearance. But his eyes remained sharp, alert, determined, the same eyes that had locked with King's that first morning in September, refusing to leave a pile of rubble where someone was dying. Those eyes had seen more horror than any dog should witness, had guided more rescues than seemed possible, and they weren't finished yet. The sirens fell silent in May 1941, not because the war had ended, but because Hitler had turned his gaze eastward toward the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa demanded the Luftwaffe's attention, and London, battered, burning but unbroken, could finally breathe. The night-after-night apocalypse was over. What remained was the slower work of recovery, clearing rubble, rebuilding homes, counting the dead, and trying to remember what peace felt like. At Air Raid Post B132 on South Hill Street, Rip continued his patrols alongside E. King. Occasional raids still came, sporadic attacks that kept the civil defense apparatus active through 1944, but the desperate urgency had lifted. When alert did sound, Rip worked with the same focused precision he'd always shown, his nose still perfect, his instincts still flawless. But the warden team around him was dissolving. Men returned to the docks and factories they'd left behind. Some enlisted in the military for service overseas. Others had died during the 12 months of hell they'd all survived together. King stayed on, and so did Rip, two veterans of a war that had moved elsewhere but left its scars deep in the rubble-scarred streets of East London. In 1943, Maria Dickin, founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, established a medal to honor the animal heroes of wartime. The Dickin Medal bore the words "For Gallantry" and "We Also Serve," Britain's recognition that courage wore fur and feathers as well as uniforms. Early recipients included carrier pigeons who'd flown through enemy fire, horses who'd carried wounded soldiers, and dogs who'd served with distinction in military operations. It was, in essence, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Rip should have been among the first recipients. His record spoke for itself. Over 100 lives saved, 0 force alerts, 12 months of service under conditions that would have broken trained dogs. But his unofficial status created a bureaucratic nightmare. He'd never been formally enrolled in any civil defense program. He had no official handler of record. He was technically just a stray who'd been tolerated at an air raid post. For 2 years, E. King wrote letters. Mrs. Fletcher submitted testimonials. Survivors whose lives Rip had saved added their voices. Slowly, reluctantly, the machinery of recognition began to turn. In 1945, as the war in Europe finally ended, Rip was awarded the Dickin Medal. The citation was characteristically understated for locating many air raid victims during the Blitz of 1940-1941. The ceremony was small. Attention had moved to victory celebrations and demobilization, but King was there, and he attached the medal to Rip's worn collar with hands that had dug through countless tons of rubble alongside this small terrier. The dog who'd been unwanted, abandoned, nearly removed from service, now wore Britain's highest honor for animal bravery. He would wear it every day for the rest of his life. And by then, Rip's legacy had already begun to reshape civil defense forever. By 1944, Britain's Home Office had established formal training programs for search and rescue dogs, directly inspired by what an untrained stray had proven instinctively possible. Every search and rescue dog trained since owes something to Rip's pioneering heroism. The small terrier who showed the world that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones nobody authorized.
By early 1946, time had caught up with Rip. He was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, no one knew for certain, but the years of service had aged him far beyond those numbers. His breathing came in laboured rattles, the legacy of countless nights inhaling smoke and cordite. His gait had stiffened from old injuries sustained navigating unstable rubble, yet still he patrolled with E. King, still wore his Dickin medal on a collar ground loose around his thinning frame, still lived in his corner at post B132. His final day was quiet. King took him on a slow walk through Poplar, past buildings still scarred by bombs dropped 5 years earlier, past sites where Rip had poured it debris until rescue teams heard the tapping beneath. King noticed the terrier moved slower, stopped more often, seemed tired in a way that sleep couldn't remedy. That evening, when King set out Rip's meal, the dog simply looked at it from his corner and didn't rise. King understood. He sat beside his partner through the night, one weathered hand resting on the small dog's side, feeling the laboured breathing gradually slow, then soften, then stop. Rip died peacefully at post B132, in the place that had been his home, with the man who'd been his friend. The People's Dispensary for Sick Animals maintained a cemetery in Ilford, Essex, for animals who'd served Britain with exceptional distinction. It was decided that Rip would be the first Dickin medal winner buried there, a final honour for a dog who'd redefined what service animals could accomplish. The ceremony drew air raid wardens who'd worked alongside him, civilians whose lives he'd saved, and civil defence officials who'd watched an unofficial stray transform their understanding of rescue operations. King's eulogy was characteristically simple. He was just a stray, the old warden said, his voice steady. Nobody wanted him, nobody trained him, but he saved more lives than any of us ever will. He showed us what courage looks like when it's not about following orders, but about doing what's right because you can't do anything else. He was the best partner I ever had. The headstone bore the essential facts: R.I.P., died 1946, Dickin Medal 1945, for locating many air raid victims during the Blitz of 1940-1941. Over 100 lives saved. Simple words for an extraordinary legacy. Rip became the first of 12 Dickin Medal winners eventually laid to rest in that cemetery, but he would always be first, the pioneer who proved what was possible. His story became legend in British civil defence circles. Training programs studied and replicated his instinctive methods, and every search and rescue dog team that would follow, through the troubles in Northern Ireland, through the 2005 London bombings, through earthquakes and disasters worldwide, owed something to what a small terrier had demonstrated during London's darkest nights. That heroism requires no pedigree, no credentials, no official authorization, only an unwavering will to save lives, even when the world has given you every reason to give up.
By the late 1940s, formal search and rescue dog programs were operating throughout Britain, their training protocols drawn directly from observations of Rip's natural methods. What had been instinct in an untrained terrier became structured doctrine for purpose-bred dogs, systematic search patterns, distinctive alert behaviors, the ability to work through dangerous conditions without faltering. Rip's grave in the PDSA cemetery at Ilford became the foundation of a tradition. 11 more Dickin Medal winners would eventually join him there, dogs who served in World War II, the Troubles, Iraq, Afghanistan. But he remained first, the pioneer who proved what was possible. His influence spread globally. By the 1950s, search and rescue dog programs were being established across Europe, North America, and Asia. The 1953 book, The Story of Rip, introduced his achievements to international audiences, and training facilities worldwide studied the documented accounts of his work during the Blitz, analyzing his methods to develop their own protocols. Today, search and rescue dogs are indispensable in disaster response worldwide, working earthquake sites, building collapses, avalanches, wilderness searches. Their training is sophisticated, their equipment advanced, their deployment systematic. But the fundamental principle remains what Rip demonstrated 80 years ago. A dog's nose can detect life where human senses fail, can find hope in rubble, can save lives no one else knows are there. In the 1960s, Catherine Davies, Rip's symbolic 100th rescue, wrote to the PDSA, "I was buried in darkness for 11 hours, certain I would die. Then I heard barking, and I knew someone had found me. That dog gave me back my life. I've lived to see my children grow, my grandchildren born, all because a stray terrier wouldn't walk away from a pile of rubble. We owe him more than we can ever repay." E. King lived until 1971, 25 years after Rip's death. He never got another dog. When asked why, he said simply, "Because he wasn't just any dog. You don't replace something like that. You just remember, and you're grateful." In 1976, a commemorative plaque was placed at South Hill Street, marking the site of Air Raid Post B-132, where Rip, Britain's first search and rescue dog, saved over 100 lives during the Blitz, 1940-1941. We also serve. Today, visitors to the PDSA cemetery in Ilford still find Rip's grave, often decorated with flowers left by emergency services personnel, SAR dog trainers, or those who simply know his story. The Dickin medal he wore is preserved in a museum, a tangible reminder of courage unmeasured by size or pedigree or official authorization. Rip's legacy teaches that true heroism doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't require credentials or training or recognition. It simply sees someone who needs help and refuses to walk away. An abandoned stray, with every reason to distrust humans, chose instead to save them. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones no one expected, the ones who weren't supposed to be there, the ones who simply couldn't walk away. That was Rip. That is why 80 years later, we still tell his story.